What lies behind the veil? A monster? A scar? A secret so shameful it must be hidden from the world? This is what they all whispered as the millionaire, Orion Crestwood, married a complete stranger. They laughed at him, pitying the man forced to wed a phantom. But they misunderstood. The veil wasn't there to hide her weakness. It was there to hide her power. And the moment it dropped, their world would never be the same. A millionaire believed he was entering an arranged marriage with an undesirable woman, his shock palpable when he wed a bride whose face remained a mystery, for everyone around him fixated on her veil, their whispers a venomous chorus behind her back, their laughter sharp and mocking. But when the moment of truth finally arrived, a profound silence seized the entire room. So please subscribe and share where you are watching this from. A thick blanket of clouds smothered the sky above the Crestwood manor, pressing down with a heavy, unspoken weight, and the low, resonant rumble of thunder became a funereal drum, its beat echoing mournfully across the rolling hills, while a cool, fine mist clung to the very air as the mourners gathered close around the gleaming, polished mahogany casket that rested at the sacred heart of the family cemetery. The headstone, already etched with finality, read Corbin A. Crestwood, 1952 to 2023, visionary, leader, father. Yet these words carved into cold stone felt hollow, utterly meaningless to Orion Crestwood as he stood as motionless as a statue, his hands buried deep within the pockets of his stark black overcoat. He had not shed a single tear, not when the fateful call had come, not at the sterile hospital, and not even now, for he had spent the better part of his 30 years being groomed for this exact moment, though not in the art of mourning. Oh no, Corbin Crestwood had trained his one and only son for the burden of inheritance the way one trains a champion thoroughbred for the Derby, with meticulous precision, with relentless pressure, and with a complete absence of affection. Everything about Corbin had been a cold calculation, ruthlessly efficient, and utterly relentless, and now, with him gone, everything had been passed down to Orion, the vast empire, the sprawling properties, the immense power, and of course, the crushing obligations. The funeral service concluded in a sea of murmured prayers and the restrained, dignified sobs of board members and distant cousins alike. But Orion remained behind long after the others had drifted away like ghosts, watching with a detached gaze as the cemetery crew lowered the coffin into the dark earth, as if it were just another mundane task in a long day filled with duties. His mother, Seraphina, approached him in silence, her hand slipping through the crook of his arm, looking so small and fragile beside his towering frame, her posture elegant, but etched with a deep fatigue. "He would have wanted you to stand tall," she whispered softly, but Orion didn't respond. He didn't feel tall, he felt like a marionette, his limbs wound tight with invisible, unbreakable strings. That evening, as the bereaved family gathered in the grand library of the main house, Orion found himself seated at the head of the long, imposing walnut table, directly beneath the oppressive weight of a heavy crystal chandelier, where the fire in the colossal stone hearth crackled and spat, casting dancing flickers of light across the room, a room lined with the stoic, judgmental portraits of his ancestors. The solicitor, Mr. Finch, an aging man with round, owlish spectacles and a clipped, precise accent, cleared his throat and opened a thick, leather-bound portfolio. The late Mr. Crestwood left behind a number of directives concerning the continuity of the family's holdings, Finch began, his voice dry. "Most of which are quite straightforward. However, there is one particular clause that requires your immediate and unwavering attention." Orion, nursing a glass of amber scotch, merely raised a skeptical brow. "Let me guess, something controlling, needlessly dramatic, and absolutely, unequivocally inconvenient." His mother cast a quiet, warning glance his way but wisely said nothing, as Mr. Finch adjusted his spectacles. "In order to maintain a binding and strategic partnership with the Azakive conglomerate, a multi-generational powerhouse with holdings in telecommunications, mining, and energy, particularly across East and Central Africa, your father committed to a permanent alliance in the form of a marriage, specifically between yourself and the Azakive's designated heir, a woman by the name of Lyra." The room plunged into a deafening silence, then Orion let out a single, harsh laugh. "You must be joking." "I'm afraid not," Mr. Finch stated, not even flinching. This was an integral part of a confidential memorandum of understanding, signed 5 years ago and updated as recently as last autumn. And the terms clearly specify that the marriage must take place within 30 days of Mr. Crestwood's passing, or the entire agreement becomes void, and the Azakai Group will immediately withdraw from all existing joint ventures. That's blackmail, Orion snarled, rising to his feet. He's using a marriage like a pawn in a chess game. I am not some token to be traded away in a corporate merger. This isn't just about you, Orion, Serafina interjected, her voice suddenly sharp. This is about preserving an empire your grandfather built from absolutely nothing, about safeguarding the livelihoods of thousands of dedicated employees. You think this is beneath you, but your father always saw the long game, he always did. And what about love, what about freedom? Orion demanded, his voice raw, and his mother simply sighed. Your father never believed in fairy tales. Orion turned away from them both, running a hand violently through his thick, blonde hair as the fire snapped angrily behind him. I don't even know this woman. I've never laid eyes on her. For all I know, she's a stranger who you will meet. Mr. Finch interrupted smoothly, glancing at his watch. Tomorrow, in fact, she and a representative of the Azakai family will be arriving at high noon. Orion just stared at him, incredulous. He really arranged all of this, even in death, he's still dictating my every move. But he arranged a future, Serafina corrected coolly. What you choose to make of it is entirely up to you. The next morning passed in a surreal, disorienting haze. As Orion awoke in the sprawling east wing of the estate, the vast bedroom with its oppressive velvet drapes and dark, paneled walls offering little to no comfort, and he dressed reluctantly in a perfectly tailored suit, knowing full well the elaborate pageantry he was now expected to uphold. Downstairs, the staff had already begun their preparations, transforming the reception parlor with fresh flowers, crisp linens, and exotic imported teas, and at noon, precisely, a sleek black Rolls-Royce pulled silently up the circular driveway. Orion watched from a high window, his arms crossed defiantly, as a tall, broad-shouldered man in traditional Zambilan attire stepped out first, followed closely by a woman in a dark, forest green dress, long-sleeved and high-necked, her face entirely obscured by a veil of black chiffon. Her posture was regal, her steps were completely soundless, and the very air around her seemed to stand perfectly still. Orion met them in the formal drawing-room with the barest, most threadbare pretense of civility, where the man introduced himself as Ambassador Emeka Azakai, Lyra's uncle, his accent warm and refined, his demeanor impeccably diplomatic as he spoke of heritage, legacy, and the power of unity, but Orion barely listened. Lyra sat beside her uncle, her hands folded demurely on her lap, speaking only when she was directly addressed, her voice calm, almost devoid of emotion, yet her diction was flawless and precise, and she never once reached up to lift her mysterious veil. After the initial, stilted pleasantries, Ambassador Azakai handed Orion a velvet box which contained a ceremonial engagement pendant, intricately carved from rare ebony and inset with gleaming gold. A symbol of our sacred union, he announced, but Orion accepted it stiffly. The meeting concluded, as such sterile affairs often do, with polite, meaningless nods and vague, hollow assurances, and Lyra never, ever removed her veil. She didn't even flinch when Orion, half out of sheer frustration, bluntly asked her why she wore it. It is my choice, she answered simply, and that night, Orion stormed into his father's old study and poured himself another stiff drink, the towering oak shelves looming around him like silent, judging sentinels, as he stared at a portrait of Orion Crestwood hanging behind the desk. You really thought you could control me from beyond the grave? He muttered. Well, congratulations, it worked. The days that followed blurred together quickly, with arrangements being formalized and legal documents signed. The wedding date was set for a mere 10 days from that initial meeting, and Serafina insisted on a private, tasteful ceremony held on the estate grounds, with no media, and no spectacle. Orion attended the fittings and rehearsals like a lifeless mannequin, completely silent, stiff, and cold, while Lyra remained an enigma, invisible, for she did not stay at the manor, but in a discreet residence nearby, granting no interviews, allowing no photographs, and making no unveiled appearances. Vicious rumors began to spread among Orion's acquaintances. Some called her a mystery, others, far more cruel, called her a scandal just waiting to erupt, and on the eve of the wedding, Orion found himself standing alone on the grand terrace, staring out at the vast lawn where neat rows of white chairs had been arranged and lanterns swayed gently in the wind, his fingers gripping the cold railing. He thought about running, about leaving it all behind him, but even he knew that his sense of duty, however fractured and begrudging it was stronger than his ego, and so the very next day, under a sky startlingly clear of clouds and watched by only a handful of close family members, Orion Crestwood married a woman he had never truly seen. She wore white, she wore the veil. She said her vows in a voice that was calm and unwavering, and Orion, with his jaw set tight, kissed the chiffon fabric that covered her cheek. There was no thunderous applause, no music swelled, no tearful embrace, only a profound silence, and the quiet, sinking realization that whatever this marriage was destined to become, it had only just begun. The applause had barely faded before Orion Crestwood turned away from the final guest with a muted nod and a tight-lipped, forced smile, for the ceremony, such as it was, had concluded not even 30 minutes ago, and yet he already felt as though countless hours had passed, the white chairs scattered across the lawn looking abandoned and forlorn, forgotten by the small, formally dressed crowd that had gathered to witness the strategic union of two immensely powerful families. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long, golden beams across the sprawling estate as the new couple posed briefly for a single, obligatory photograph, he standing tall and rigid, she beside him, cloaked in ivory silk and black chiffon, her face entirely hidden from the world's view, and when the photographer requested a second picture, this time with them facing each other, Orion hesitated. He looked at Lyra, whose veil flowed gently in the breeze like a thin, living, breathing thing, her posture graceful, unmoved, the same collected stillness that had clung to her since the very moment they first met, and he turned back to the camera instead, his jaw clenched, and the shutter clicked with a final, jarring sound. By evening, the reception had shifted indoors to the grand ballroom, its high, vaulted ceiling glittering with a galaxy of chandeliers and the soft, warm glow of candlelight, where a string quartet played near the massive marble fireplace, their music delicate, elegant, and unobtrusive. The long, ornate tables, adorned with white roses and gold-trimmed crystal, were filled with carefully selected guests, distant relatives, powerful shareholders, and high society allies, all of them speaking in polite, clipped tones, their intense curiosity thinly veiled beneath practiced, insincere smiles. Orion sat at the head table beside his new wife, separated by a vast gulf of silence rather than mere physical space, for Lyra sat perfectly poised, her hands folded on her lap, a plate of untouched delicacies sitting before her, because she hadn't removed the veil, not even to sip champagne. A few brave or perhaps foolish guests dared to whisper their theories between forkfuls of expensive caviar. "Maybe she's a recluse," one woman murmured, her voice dripping with condescension. "I heard she was horribly disfigured in an accident years ago," said another. "Perhaps she's hiding something much, much worse." Orion heard every single poisonous word, his ears now trained like a soldier's on a battlefield, and he clenched the stem of his glass harder, biting back a savage retort. But what was he to say? That he knew no more than they did, that the mystery infuriated him too, and when he finally risked a glance toward Lyra, she was calmly buttering a roll, her movements completely unbothered. For not a single muscle in her body betrayed the slightest discomfort. It was as though the whispers meant absolutely nothing to her, or worse, she had fully anticipated them, and later, when the music swelled and couples began to drift onto the dance floor, Orion made no move to join them. He remained at the table, drinking, watching as Lyra exchanged polite nods with an older woman across the room. She hadn't spoken more than a dozen words to him all evening. Even the short ride from the ceremony to the ballroom had passed in a heavy, suffocating silence, their shared limousine filled only with the soft sound of tires on gravel and the awkward, cavernous space between two strangers now bound together by law. And as the clock neared midnight, a butler approached discreetly and informed them that their private suite was ready. Orion rose from his chair mechanically, offering Lyra his arm as protocol demanded, and she accepted it lightly, without a hint of hesitation, and they exited the ballroom to a brief rustle of silk and a wave of murmurs that followed them like a persistent shadow. The suite was located in the northern wing of the estate, far removed from the other guest rooms, and it was lavishly appointed with tall windows, priceless antique furniture, and a grand four-poster bed draped in delicate ivory gauze, where a small fireplace crackled warmly in the corner, and a tray of chocolates and champagne sat untouched atop a polished table. Orion entered first, and immediately tossed his jacket onto a nearby chair with a sigh of exhaustion, and Lyra followed him in, her footsteps soft and silent against the plush carpet. He then turned to face her, the immense weight of the day pressing down on his shoulders like a physical anchor. "Are you going to keep that thing on forever?" he asked, his voice sharp, nodding dismissively toward the veil, and she began removing her gloves, one finger at a time, completely unhurried. "Until I am ready," she replied calmly. He laughed bitterly, the sound dry and hollow in the quiet, opulent room. "Ready for what? To finally reveal whatever it is you're hiding, or are you just enjoying this twisted little game?" Lyra set the gloves neatly on the vanity, then turned to face him fully, her eyes just visible through the sheer black fabric. "This is not a game, Orion, and I am not hiding anything that should matter. But, not to you, maybe," he shot back. "But I'm the one they're whispering about, I'm the one standing next to a bride no one is allowed to see. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" She tilted her head slightly, not in defiance, but with the quiet air of someone who had already weighed and measured this very argument countless times before. "If their opinions matter more to you than I do, then perhaps you should reconsider what this marriage is truly about." The words landed with more force than he ever expected, and he opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, as she turned away and began undoing the clasp of her necklace, the room falling into a heavy silence once more, broken only by the crackle of the firewood and the faint clink of metal on cold marble. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, downed it in one swift go, and walked to the far end of the sprawling suite. "Fine," he muttered under his breath. "Keep your secrets, but don't expect me to wait around forever." She said nothing. Instead, she seated herself at the vanity, removed her earrings with quiet, deliberate care, and began brushing her long hair beneath the veil, and Orion watched her for a moment longer, something tight and unfamiliar twisting painfully in his chest. Anger, yes, but also a deep confusion, and if he were being completely honest, a burning curiosity. That night they slept on opposite sides of the suite, two complete strangers adrift in a palace of suffocating luxury, two names on a legal certificate, and the vast space between them echoed louder than any sacred vow ever could. The days that followed did little to thaw the frost that had settled between them, for Orion buried himself completely in his work, retreating to his office at the crack of dawn and returning long after the sun had set, his world shrinking to meetings, mergers, and memos, and he welcomed the distraction. At home, he kept entirely to himself, speaking to Lyra only when absolutely necessary, and never beyond what basic civility required, but she did not press him, she neither sought him out nor imposed her presence upon him, yet, despite their shared silence, he began to notice things. The household staff, once clumsy and frustratingly slow, now moved with a newfound precision and grace, the kitchens ran smoother than ever before, the garden was better tended, and even the library, long neglected and forgotten, now gleamed as though dust had never dared to touch its hallowed shelves. Orion observed these subtle changes like one might observe shifting weather patterns, quietly, without any acknowledgement, but not without a growing awareness, and he passed Lyra once in the hallway as she was speaking softly to Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, her tone soft but unmistakably assertive. She held a small list in her hand and Mrs. Gable was nodding attentively. When she noticed Orion, Lyra simply inclined her head in a polite, formal acknowledgement, and he nodded back stiffly and kept on walking. One afternoon, while reviewing a particularly thorny merger proposal in the sunlit study, Orion found himself stuck on a legal clause that stubbornly refused to make any sense. He cursed under his breath and pushed the papers aside in frustration, and then, "May I?" came a voice from behind him. He turned, surprised. Lyra stood in the doorway, holding a closed book in her hands. She wore a simple dress, her veil thinner than usual, allowing more of her delicate outline to be seen, and he blinked. "This isn't exactly your area of expertise," he said, not unkindly, but not invitingly either, but she stepped forward anyway. "Perhaps not, but I've read the proposal. The issue isn't with the numbers, it's the ambiguity in this one paragraph." She reached down and pointed to a section with her gloved fingers. "This phrase, subject to discretion, leaves far too much room for interpretation. That is why the other party is so hesitant." Orion leaned in, despite himself, for she was right. "How do you even know that?" he asked, genuinely curious. "I read," she said simply, and he stared at her, searching her eyes through the fabric. But she was already stepping back, book still in hand. "Tighten the phrasing, be specific, and you will have your deal." Then she left, and Orion was left staring after her, something unsettled and new brewing deep in his chest. And that evening, as he sat alone in his office, he found himself remembering her words, her tone, her undeniable presence, not loud, not demanding, but deliberate, measured, and incredibly precise. The veil no longer seemed like a wall, it felt more like a puzzle, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to solve it, or if he feared what he might find hiding beneath. The days after that brief, startling encounter in the study passed with a strange and disconcerting stillness, for Orion found himself increasingly aware of Lyra's presence, or rather, her quiet, pervasive influence. And it was not just the study or the merger, though he had indeed followed her suggestion, and the deal had moved forward smoothly ever since. No, it was something more insidious, more all-encompassing, and infinitely harder to name. It was in the silence of the halls, which no longer echoed with disorganization. It was in the rhythmic hum of a household that was now functioning more efficiently than it ever had before, and it was in the way the staff seemed to carry themselves with a faint but unmistakable air of assurance, as if they were no longer serving a cold, distant dynasty, but a living, breathing order. Yet, for all the subtlety of her presence, she remained in many ways a complete phantom. Orion would hear her soft voice in passing, offering clear, concise instructions to the kitchen staff, engaging with the gardener about intricate planting schedules, asking the butler about the timing of supply deliveries, but she never raised her voice, never demanded attention, and never positioned herself as the lady of the manor. She simply moved through it, adjusting small things here and there, correcting long-standing inefficiencies, healing fractures that had been too long ignored, and she did all of this from beneath her ever-present, mysterious veil. And Orion kept to his routines, partly out of ingrained habit, partly out of an unspoken resistance to the profound effect she was beginning to have on him. He would rise early and retreat to his office, spend his hours on endless calls and contracts, and take his dinners in the West Parlor, or on occasion, out in the city under the convenient guise of business. But more and more often he found himself thinking of that brief moment in the study, of her voice, her clarity, her absolute, unshakable composure. He would catch himself staring blankly at his notes during important meetings, wondering what she might have said about a particular clause or a different angle, and the realization irritated him immensely, for she was supposed to be an inconvenience, a mere obligation, but instead, she was becoming a constant presence in his thoughts. One evening, as he returned from a late meeting downtown, he passed through the long corridor near the library and heard the faint, beautiful sound of piano music, soft and hesitant at first, then growing bolder and more confident, and curious. He paused by the door, which was slightly ajar. Inside, he saw her, Lyra, seated at the grand piano, her fingers gliding across the keys with a fluid, effortless grace that betrayed years and years of dedicated practice. She wore a simple gray dress, and her veil was a lighter fabric than usual, almost translucent in the warm, gentle lamplight. Her posture was straight, elegant, and she was completely alone, and for a moment her face tilted up toward the music. Orion caught a fleeting glimpse of something more than just restraint. There was a deep longing there, or perhaps a profound sorrow, but he didn't enter. He stood there quietly until the music faded into silence, then walked away, his heart feeling oddly unsteady. Days later, as the weekend approached, Serafina invited them both to a charity brunch hosted by the Crestwood Foundation. It was meant to be a small affair, but still high-profile enough to warrant their appearances, and Orion reluctantly agreed, and when he informed Lyra over breakfast, an awkward, mostly silent affair at the breakfast nook in the conservatory, she simply nodded without question. "We're expected at noon," he said. "You don't have to speak, just show up." And she didn't answer immediately, then simply said, "I will be ready." And he wasn't sure what he'd been expecting, resistance, maybe, some small sign of displeasure, but instead, her composure was, as always, absolute. He stood there, unsure whether to say something more, then left with a faint scowl at himself for even wanting to prolong the exchange, and at the brunch, Lyra arrived a few minutes after him, dressed in a flowing, dark teal ensemble with long sleeves and a high neckline. The veil was of a matching fabric, embroidered subtly at the edges, and she moved beside him without any effort, like a shadow that cast no weight. The guests, predictably, fell into hushed clusters around the terrace and garden path, their conversations laced with a mixture of curiosity and cold calculation, and Orion kept close to the bar, sipping his drink and offering only the most necessary greetings, while Lyra exchanged polite nods, but spoke very little. He caught snippets of conversation nearby. "Still hiding, I see," murmured one woman from behind a bejeweled clutch. "Perhaps she doesn't speak English," someone else whispered. "Or perhaps she simply doesn't want to." Orion's fingers curled tightly around his glass, and when he turned, ready to snap, Lyra lightly touched his arm. The gesture was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to stop him. "They will speak regardless," she said quietly. He looked at her then, really looked, trying to read her expression through the veil, but there was nothing but a profound calm, an unyielding stillness he was beginning to realize had been earned through hard experience, not indifference, and that night, he asked her over another shared dinner of silent courses and clinking silverware. "Doesn't it bother you, what they say?" Lyra looked up from her plate. "What they say is not new." Her answer lingered in his mind long after they had parted for the night, for the more he saw of her, the more Orion realized that her silence was not emptiness, it was a profound strength, the way she carried herself, the way she never apologized for existing in the space she'd been given, the way she listened carefully before speaking. These were not the traits of someone who was hiding, but of someone who had been misjudged many times before and had learned that patience was the best and only armor. One morning, while reviewing updates on the Azakai partnership in the dining room, Orion found himself muttering over a series of proposals and cultural outreach initiatives, and he didn't notice Lyra enter until she spoke. "There's a line in there that is poorly phrased," she said, gesturing to the screen, and he frowned. "You've read this?" "I asked for a copy." And he blinked. "Why?" "Because it is my family's legacy, too." Her tone wasn't confrontational, just a simple matter of fact, and he paused, then looked back at the document. She was right again. That afternoon, he gave his assistant, Clara, instructions to start including Lyra in the distribution of certain important reports. He wasn't entirely sure why, perhaps because he could no longer deny her incredible insight, perhaps because a part of him was growing tired of pretending she didn't matter, or perhaps, if he were being brutally honest with himself, because he wanted to see what she would do with real power. The next few weeks passed in a strange rhythm that neither of them acknowledged aloud. They shared space now, not warmth, not yet, but a definite presence. They had dinner together more often than not, sometimes discussing the news, sometimes just sitting in a comfortable silence, and Orion began asking for her opinion during his late-night review sessions, and she began offering them without waiting to be invited. He noticed things, the way she arranged flowers in a vase by the window, the way she left tea for him on his desk when he returned from long meetings, the way her veil fluttered slightly when she laughed at one of the butler's dry, witty jokes, and the distance between them was shrinking, not fast, not dramatically, but steadily, and yet, for all of this, the veil remained, always the veil. One evening, after a long day of back-to-back negotiations, Orion returned to find Lyra speaking to Mrs. Gable in the foyer. The older woman smiled as she handed Lyra a small bundle of fresh herbs from the kitchen garden. "I didn't know you were interested in cooking," he said, unthinking, and Lyra turned, the bundle in her hand. "Only in feeding people properly." He smirked. "And here I thought you were here to torment me with your secrets." And for a moment, just a fleeting moment, He thought she might smile beneath the fabric. Her eyes softened. "I don't torment you, Orion, you torment yourself." Later that night, he stood outside her sitting room door for nearly a full minute before deciding not to knock. He returned to his own side of the suite and lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how it was possible to feel so close to someone he still didn't really know, and wondering more than ever if the mystery was something she wore to protect herself, or something she offered him piece by piece, just to see if he was worthy of the truth that lay underneath. By the time October settled over the Crestwood manor, the trees lining the long drive had turned brilliant shades of amber and crimson, the wind carried a distinct crispness that whispered of the approaching winter, and the days grew shorter, pushing dusk into the mid-afternoon, and inside the house, routines had settled into something that resembled comfort, or perhaps, a truce. Orion no longer avoided Lyra, nor did he retreat from her presence. They dined together most evenings, discussed company matters with a rhythm that verged on a comfortable ease, and moved through the same spaces with a quiet familiarity that had not existed just weeks before, but the veil remained. The morning of the crisis began like any other. Orion sat at his desk reviewing the latest update on the Solstice merger, an international acquisition that had been a crucial linchpin in the Crestwood Group's future expansion, and he had spent months nurturing the deal, aligning board support, and smoothing over cultural nuances with the Solstice executives. It was delicate, painstaking work, but necessary. And now, with the final round of approval on the line, it threatened to completely unravel. "Sir?" his assistant Clara said as she entered the room, holding a thin stack of papers. "There's been a development, you need to see this." Orion took the papers and scanned them quickly, his brow furrowing, for the Solstice's legal team had flagged a series of clauses they now suddenly deemed problematic: vague language, cultural oversteps, insufficient clarity on profit-sharing models. In short, everything they had previously accepted without any concern had now been thrown into serious question. "They're threatening to pull out?" Orion asked, his voice low but tight. "They've halted all further meetings for now," Clara confirmed, and he stood up, tossing the papers onto the desk in disgust. "Damn it, we're 2 weeks from signing." Clara hesitated. "Their lead counsel requested a review in a more neutral setting, whatever that means." He paced the length of the study, frustration burning through his chest like a fire. Months of effort, relationships, strategy, all for nothing because someone on their side had gotten too clever with language, or because Solstice was looking for an excuse, or both. And later that evening, as he sat in the formal dining room, absently pushing food across his plate, Lyra observed him with a calm, quiet attentiveness. He hadn't said much since she entered. The fire behind them glowed softly, casting long shadows along the carved mantelpiece, and the crystal glasses on the table remained full. "You're troubled," she said simply, and Orion looked up tired. "I'm losing the Solstice deal. It's collapsing right under our feet." She said nothing, just waiting, and he sighed and leaned back. "They think we're arrogant, that we wrote this thing with too much legal muscle and too little cultural respect. I tried to work around it, but they've gone completely silent." Lyra reached for her water then. "Invite them here." And he blinked. "Here, to the manor?" She nodded. "Yes, not to a sterile boardroom, not to a cold hotel, to your home. Let them see who you are beyond the harsh language in a contract." "They don't care about who I am," he replied dismissively. "They care about what they're signing." "And then show them both," she said, her voice even and steady. "Let them sit at your table, let them feel the weight of your commitment, not just to profit, but to a genuine partnership." Orion looked at her, not quite scoffing, but close. "You think a dinner party is going to fix this? I think a carefully constructed atmosphere can do what sterile documents cannot." And he stared at her across the table, seeing not just a veiled stranger now, but a master strategist, one with immense patience, vision, and a different kind of intelligence than he was used to trusting. After a long pause, he exhaled. "Fine, you think it'll work, then help me plan it." "And I already have," she replied, and she had, for in the days that followed, Lyra took to the task with an efficiency that completely stunned him. She reviewed the profiles of every single Solstice executive who would be attending, prepare detailed notes on cultural etiquette, dietary preferences, and even historical family ties. She coordinated with the chef to design a menu that perfectly balanced French and African cuisine, honoring both Solstice's roots and the Azakai family's traditions. And she worked with the household staff to prepare rooms in the East Wing for the overnight guests, and even personally supervised the placement of the long dining table in the greenhouse atrium, where the autumn leaves would serve as natural decoration under strings of warm, glowing lanterns. Orion watched it all unfold with a strange mixture of admiration and discomfort. She moved like someone who was born to command a space, not through loud authority, but through a quiet, unshakable certainty. Her veil never left her face, but somehow, she saw everything. He began to defer to her more than he ever expected to, sometimes without even realizing it, and when the evening of the dinner finally arrived, the estate was aglow with gentle, welcoming light. The greenhouse had been transformed into a haven of understated elegance, with crisp linen tablecloths, golden cutlery, and low, artful arrangements of crimson dahlias and autumn berries, the air carrying the rich scent of cedarwood and saffron. The Solstice delegation arrived just after sunset, their cars pulling into the drive with a practiced pomp, and Orion greeted them personally, and for the first time in weeks, he felt something like composure returning to him. He walked beside Lyra into the atrium, his hand lightly guiding her, and introduced her, not by title, but simply as my wife and partner. No one questioned the veil. Perhaps it was her poise, perhaps it was the way she stood without any apology, as though she had already earned the respect they didn't yet know how to offer, and the dinner began with quiet conversation and cautious toasts. The wine flowed, and so did the stories. Lyra engaged delicately, asking the Solstice executives thoughtful, insightful questions about their work, their homes, their histories. She remembered details, connected dots between one anecdote and the next. Her presence was not commanding in volume, but in its sheer gravity, and the guests leaned in when she spoke, and smiled when she laughed. By the time dessert was served, a delicate dish of spiced citrus cream over a rosewater sponge, Orion could see the tension literally melting from the shoulders of everyone around the table. It was working, and after the guests had retired to the lounge for a final round of drinks, Orion pulled Lyra aside into the hallway near the conservatory entrance. "You're good at this," he said quietly, and she regarded him through the veil. "I know." And he smiled in spite of himself. "I didn't expect this to work. I didn't expect you to make it work. I didn't do it for you," she said softly. "I did it because it needed to be done." And he nodded, the smile fading. "Still, thank you." And she hesitated, then touched his wrist gently. "You're welcome." The next morning, the Solstice executives held an informal meeting over breakfast and confirmed their intention to move forward with the merger, and Orion received the news with a profound relief, but also with a deep sense of something else, a recognition that without Lyra, it would have failed, and at the board meeting that followed, several directors commended his impressive diplomacy. He accepted their praise with practiced professionalism, but inside, he knew exactly who had salvaged the deal, and that evening, he returned home and found Lyra in the library, seated by the tall windows, reading, and he stood silently for a moment before speaking. "I owe you more than thanks." She looked up. "You owe me nothing." "And that's not true," he said. "You saved something I couldn't." She closed the book carefully. "It was ours to save." And he walked toward her, then paused. "Why did you do it, Lyra? Why involve yourself so deeply in a deal that means nothing to you personally?" She considered the question. "Because it's not just a deal, it's a foundation, and foundations are only as strong as the people willing to uphold them." He sank into the chair across from her, tired, but no longer burdened. "Then maybe I've misjudged you." "And maybe," she said, and for the first time in weeks, he found himself leaning forward, not just in posture, but in intent. Would you stay a while, talk with me?" She didn't move at first, then she nodded, and they talked long into the evening, the fire in the hearth slowly burning down into embers. They spoke not only of business, but of memory, her childhood summers in Zambala, his lonely schooling in Switzerland, the crushing loneliness of inheritance, and the constant ache of always being watched. When they finally parted, He found himself lingering at the door of her room longer than necessary, and the next morning, he woke with a strange sense of anticipation. The veil was still there, but so was something new, trust, perhaps, or the first, fragile breath of something that might one day become it. Autumn settled fully over the estate, cloaking the grounds in a veil of fading gold and gray. The gardens, once bursting with the late summer's vibrance, had softened into muted, melancholic tones. Leaves carpeted the walkways, and the fountains, though still running, now reflected a cooler, paler sky. And inside the house, warmth radiated not just from the fireplaces, but from something else, something less tangible, yet unmistakably present. Since the evening of the solstice dinner, Orion had begun to see Lyra in a light he had not thought possible. Her presence was no longer a mystery to be solved, but a steady, reliable force he had come to rely on. Their interactions were no longer laced with abiding tension, but marked by a mutual awareness, and more surprising than anything, a deep comfort. He now sought her opinion with genuine sincerity, listened without skepticism, and in moments of shared silence, felt no need to fill the void with meaningless noise. The veil remained, yes, but its symbolism had shifted. It no longer stood between them. It had become part of a shared rhythm neither had expected, but both had now accepted. Still, outside the protective boundaries of the estate, that understanding was fragile, for the world did not know the profound evolution that had taken place within these walls. It saw only what it wished to see: a young, white billionaire married to a veiled, black woman of foreign heritage, whose silence was interpreted as secrecy, and whose composure was mistaken for defiance. The press, once respectful under the powerful shield of wealth and influence, had begun to speculate more boldly. Whispers in salons and cocktail bars turned into screaming online headlines. "The billionaire's bride, what is she hiding? Marriage of convenience or cultural cage? The woman behind the veil, a political power move." Orion saw the articles. He dismissed them publicly, even as he read each and every word with a growing, simmering unease. Lyra, on the other hand, made no mention of the rampant speculation, and when he asked her one evening if it bothered her, she had simply said, "It is not new." But Orion was not as practiced in the art of endurance, and it was at a charity gala in central London that everything shifted. The event had been planned months in advance, long before the merger or the marriage, and was now being framed as the Crestwood Foundation's first major public appearance since Orion's wedding. It was a formal affair held at the Grand Sovereign Hall, with an elite guest list, an auction to support education initiatives in underserved communities, and a guest speaker from the House of Lords. The press was invited, cameras were expected, and appearances mattered. Orion had debated whether to bring Lyra. He hated the idea of her being paraded in front of people who did not deserve her presence. But when he raised the topic with her, she looked at him and said, "This is your world. If I am to be your partner, I will walk through it." She arrived at the gala in a floor-length black gown with exquisite gold embroidery that shimmered subtly beneath the grand chandeliers. Her veil, sheer but still concealing, was fastened with an ornate pin at her shoulder, and she stood beside Orion with a grace that neither demanded attention nor bowed under it, for the flash of cameras did not make her flinch. She greeted those introduced to her with a polite nod and a soft-spoken greeting. She was, in every respect, a dignified enigma, and the evening progressed smoothly until the keynote speech, when Lord Harrington, a long-time acquaintance of Orion's late father, took the stage with the overblown confidence of a man who had never been challenged in his life. His speech began with tired platitudes about philanthropy and legacy, shifted into a commentary on the global economic climate, and then, with a subtle, condescending smirk, veered into dangerous waters. "In times like these," he said, glancing directly toward Orion's table, "we must be careful not to mistake novelty for progress. Not every union forged in haste is forged in wisdom, and not every mask conceals a noble purpose." There was a pause. A wave of laughter rippled through the room, not loud, but sharp enough. Some guests exchanged knowing glances, others sipped their champagne to avoid a reaction, and Orion felt a hot anger rise in his chest, but Lyra, seated beside him, did not move. Harrington continued, "We live in an age where optics matter more than substance, where alliances are made not out of respect, but out of sheer expediency, and where one wonders if some traditions, like seeing the face of your own bride, are worth preserving after all. That did it. Orion stood, the motion was fluid, but the silence it commanded was absolute. He did not wait for permission, he crossed the room toward the stage with slow, deliberate steps, the way a storm builds just before it breaks, and Harrington paused, clearly not expecting a response. I wasn't aware, Orion said, his voice calm but edged with cold iron, that the purpose of this evening was to insult my wife under the pathetic pretense of tradition. And gasps rose from the audience, murmurs flared, and Harrington blinked, flustered. I merely meant to say dash. But Orion cut him off. That your idea of tradition is so fragile it cannot endure the presence of a woman who chooses dignity over display, or that your definition of progress must be filtered through your own comfort? The room was dead silent now, the cameras as still as statues. My wife, Orion said, turning to face the entire room, has conducted herself with more honor, intelligence, and courage than anyone in this room tonight, including myself. If you are uncomfortable with the way she presents herself, that is a reflection of your limitations, not hers. Lyra had not moved, but her hand now rested lightly on the edge of the table, her fingers curled with a quiet, palpable tension, and Orion's gaze swept the room. Let this be perfectly clear. Her veil is not a wall, it is a mirror. And if you see something you dislike in it, perhaps it is your own reflection you truly fear. Then he turned, walked back to the table, and extended his hand to Lyra. Shall we? She rose without a word, slipped her hand into his, and together they walked out of the gala without a single backward glance, and the fallout was immediate. The press exploded the next morning with headlines. Crestwood defends veiled wife in fiery speech. Orion Crestwood confronts aristocracy in shock rebuttal. And video clips of the moment circulated widely, spawning thousands of comments, op-eds, and think pieces. Some praised his defense of Lyra as progressive and bold, while others accused him of virtue signaling, of hiding behind theatrics to distract from his wife's continued secrecy. Back at the estate, Orion collapsed into a chair in the study, rubbing his temples. He expected Lyra to be furious, or at the very least, disapproving of the spectacle, but instead, she sat across from him, serene. You didn't have to do that, she said after a long silence, and he looked up. Yes, I did. I've endured worse, she said. That doesn't mean you should have to endure it again. And she watched him, the fire crackled in the hearth. I didn't know if you'd be angry, he admitted, for making a scene. I was surprised, she said, but not angry. And he leaned back, breathing out. I couldn't let him speak about you that way, not when you've done nothing but carry yourself with grace and strength. Her hands folded in her lap. It mattered, and he looked at her. What did? That you saw me, that you didn't need to see my face to know who I am. He hesitated. I don't know everything about you, Lyra, not yet, but I know enough to know you deserve better than what this world has tried to project onto you. And her voice, when it came, was quiet. And you're starting to understand why I wear it. He nodded. I'm not hiding, she said. I'm choosing how I am seen. And he met her gaze, the only part of her face he could see clearly through the veil. Then I'll wait until you choose to show me more. They sat in silence for a long while after that, the distance between them now filled not with uncertainty, but with something quieter, something gentler, and outside, the wind rattled the windows, and the last of the golden leaves scattered across the wide lawn. The weeks following the gala settled into a rhythm that felt markedly different from anything Orion Crestwood had experienced before, for there was, in the aftermath of the scandal and its whirlwind of media attention, a profound shift not only in how the world perceived his marriage, but in how he and Lyra now existed within it. The air between them no longer crackled with unspoken judgment or wary distance. Something had been named, stood up for, defended, and in the space that defense had carved out, something new had finally begun to breathe, and the press, ever ravenous, circled for days, photographers camped outside the gates, and headlines continued to speculate, yet Orion ignored them with an ease he had once only feigned. Lyra, as ever, remained unmoved. She conducted herself with a quiet, regal elegance, navigating each day with the same calm presence that had once mystified him and now utterly compelled him. he began to notice the finer brush strokes of her character, the way she paused to greet the gardener each morning as she strolled through the orchard, her gentle reminders to the chef to incorporate locally grown produce. The carefully annotated notes she left for the staff detailing ways to optimize everything from inventory systems to guest protocols. She never demanded attention, and yet the house now moved in a perfect rhythm with her. It was no longer just a place he had inherited, it was becoming a home, and she, somehow, had become its very heartbeat, and for Orion, the change was subtle at first. It showed in the way he lingered over breakfast longer than he once did, even when he had important meetings waiting. It crept into the way he listened when Lyra spoke, not just to her ideas, but to the way she delivered them, always with a deep thoughtfulness and precision. He began asking for her input on matters far beyond the company, inviting her into conversations about charitable foundations, legacy projects, and education initiatives. At first, he expected hesitation, but Lyra stepped into each and every role he offered her, not as a guest, but as a rightful occupant, and one afternoon, as rain tapped steadily against the tall windows of the estate's south gallery, Orion sat across from her at a small table, reviewing plans for a new public arts initiative. He had reached a decision point about the project's location, and was leaning toward a site near the financial district. Lyra listened as he laid out his logic, then gently shook her head. "It's logical," she said, "but it's also forgettable. That district already has funding, exposure, and foot traffic. This initiative is about accessibility. If you place it where no one expects it, somewhere underserved perhaps, you shift perception, not just about art, but about the people who are allowed to experience it." Orion sat back, surprised by the sheer clarity of her argument. "You've thought about this." "And I think about everything," she replied, not with pride, but with the serene acknowledgement of someone who had been underestimated many times before, and he nodded slowly. "You're right." Later that week, he presented the new location to the board, citing Lyra's reasoning. It was met with initial resistance, then gradually with approval, and when he returned home that evening, he found her in the conservatory, reading. He sat beside her, not needing to speak. She closed her book, and they watched the rain together in a comfortable silence. The ease between them deepened. They began to take walks together, sometimes around the gardens, other times down the estate's long forest path, and one evening, as twilight bathed the trees in indigo and rose, Orion found himself asking a question that had long sat unspoken. "Do you ever think about what this might have been like if we'd met differently?" Lyra walked quietly beside him for a moment before answering. "I used to, when it was harder, and now?" She paused. "Now I think about what it is becoming." He looked at her then, a slow, gentle warmth filling his chest. "And what do you see?" And she turned her head just slightly, her eyes catching the fading light through the veil. "Something worth tending." There were moments when Orion found himself aching to see her face, not from frustration, but from something much deeper. He no longer saw the veil as a barrier. It was part of her, yes, but also part of what had shaped her. He had learned to read the nuance in her eyes, in the way she moved, in the tilt of her head when she considered something. But still there was a longing now, not for proof of beauty, for he no longer questioned that, but for a connection, unmediated and whole. And one night, as they sat in the library reviewing the latest philanthropic reports, he leaned back in his chair and looked at her carefully. "I know I said I would wait," he began, his voice low. "And I meant that, but I also want you to know that I'm not waiting because I need to be convinced of anything." Lyra closed the folder in her lap, her hands stilling. "I see you," he said. "Maybe not in the way the world demands, but I see you, and I trust you. I trust who you are beneath it all." She didn't answer at first, then, with the gentlest of motions, she reached across the space between them and rested her hand over his. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm almost ready." And though she didn't say more, her words stayed with him long into the night. The estate prepared for its next major event, a winter gala celebrating the success of the education foundation Lyra had helped to expand, and Orion insisted she be recognized, but Lyra demurred. "It's not time," she said. "Let them see the work before they see the woman." He respected that, but he also realized how profoundly he admired her for it, and when the gala evening arrived, Orion stood beneath the grand staircase greeting guests while the ballroom filled with dignitaries, artists, educators, and members of the Foundation's growing network. The room glowed with candlelight and winter florals, deep reds, creams, and golds. Laughter and music filled the air. But Lyra was not yet present. He glanced at the clock, then again at the stairs. He told himself not to expect anything, for she had not promised anything. And then the room changed. It was not loud, it was not even sudden, it was the collective intake of breath that swept through the ballroom as heads turned as one toward the staircase. There she stood, for the very first time, without the veil. She wore a gown of deep emerald green that clung to her frame with a subtle elegance, the fabric catching the light with each graceful step. Her skin was luminous, her cheekbones high, her mouth serene. But it was her eyes, those gray, unwavering eyes, that held the entire room captive. She descended with a calm born not of vanity, but of absolute choice. Orion had seen many beautiful women in his life, but never before had he seen a moment so quietly powerful, so unequivocally her own. She walked toward him, and the crowd parted instinctively. When she reached him, he whispered, "Why now?" And she looked at him. "Because it's time." Then, turning to the crowd, she spoke. "I know many of you have wondered why I chose to conceal my face," she began, her voice clear, smooth, and deliberate. "Some assumed it was shame, or secrecy, or something to be hidden, but the truth is simpler. I wanted to be seen not for how I look, but for what I believe in, what I build, what I stand for." A silence fell across the room, not tense, not cold, but reverent. "In a world that rushes to judge what it sees, I wanted to offer a different kind of introduction, and tonight, I thank those who took the time to look deeper." Orion stepped beside her, his expression unreadable to all but her. "I see you," he said quietly. "I always have." The rest of the evening unfolded with an incredible warmth and joy. Lyra moved through the ballroom with a quiet confidence that needed no explanation. Guests who had once whispered now approached with genuine curiosity and respect. Those who had doubted found themselves humbled. And Orion, standing beside her, knew with absolute certainty that this was no longer the woman his father had arranged for him to marry. This was the woman he had chosen, wholly and freely. Later that night, on the balcony overlooking the snow-dusted gardens, they stood together, wrapped in silence. "You were right," he said softly. "They needed to see the work first." And Lyra leaned gently against him. "And now, they'll see everything else." He kissed her temple, and for the first time since their union began, there was no veil between them, only the open night, the soft hush of falling snow, and the quiet certainty of what had grown between two strangers under one roof, now something rooted, something real, something undeniable. Snow lingered on the window sills of the Crestwood manor like delicate lace work, deliberate and beautiful, the world outside blanketed in a quiet white, for winter had settled in fully, cloaking the landscape in a silence that felt not barren, but rich, like soil resting before the promise of spring. And inside, fires burned gently in the hearths, warm light pooled in reading corners and over polished floors. And the house breathed in perfect harmony with the two people now at its center. Since the gala, everything had changed, though not in the way dramatic stories often claim. There had been no sudden fanfare, no shocking revelation that shifted the axis of their world. Rather, the change had been subtle, deeply felt, and quietly monumental, for the veil, once a symbol of distance and mystery, was gone, and with its removal came a new rhythm between Orion and Lyra, one rooted in clarity, in trust, and in the mutual decision to move forward without the need for any pretense. Their mornings now began in tandem. Coffee was brewed not by the staff but by Orion himself, a small habit he insisted on, and they would sit in the sunlit breakfast nook and talk, sometimes about the day ahead, sometimes about nothing at all. These small rituals, once so foreign, had become precious. Orion found himself looking forward to the warmth of her presence, to the sound of her voice breaking the morning stillness, and Lyra, too, had transformed, not in her essence, for her essence had always been the same, but in how freely she now let it shine. She smiled more easily, she laughed sometimes. Her posture, always composed, now carried something more, something open, grounded, and unburdened. The woman who had once walked through corridors like a silent shadow now stood fully in the light, not because she had changed, but because he finally saw her for what she truly was, and professionally, their bond deepened with a similar grace. Orion, once so guarded over the inner workings of his empire, now involved Lyra in decisions large and small, not as a courtesy, but as a necessity. Her insight had proven not only useful, but invaluable, for she had a way of seeing through the noise, of finding the heart of a matter when others became lost in ego or numbers. Where Orion brought vision and decisiveness, Lyra brought clarity and balance. They had become, in every way, partners. One afternoon, as a biting wind blew outside and the house hummed with the quiet activity of winter preparation, Orion entered the main study holding a file. Lyra sat near the fire, her fingers wrapped around a warm cup of tea, and he dropped into the chair opposite her and handed over the file. "Meridian merger," he said. "Their board wants to revisit the profit-sharing model again." She raised an eyebrow as she skimmed the pages. "They're still dancing around the sustainability clause. I think they're trying to buy time or leverage." And Lyra nodded. "Then it's time to change the framing, focus less on percentages, more on shared longevity. They need to see this as a partnership, not a feeding ground." Orion leaned back, watching her with a smile. "You know," he said after a pause, "if I didn't have you, I'd probably still be sending angry emails and losing the deal entirely." "You would have gotten there," she replied. "Not like this." And they met with the Meridian board later that week. Lyra joined the meeting for the first time, not as Orion's guest, but as his strategic advisor. There were raised eyebrows, certainly, some from those still unaccustomed to her presence, others from those not ready to reconcile her authority with their own assumptions, but Lyra, calm and unshaken, addressed each and every point with a quiet confidence. Her analysis was sharp, her delivery poised, and when she spoke, the entire room listened. Afterward, as they walked down the corridor toward the elevator, Orion turned to her. "You were incredible. And I was honest," she said. "Sometimes that's enough." And that night they dined together in the conservatory, the moonlight catching on the frost-laced glass above, and Orion watched her across the table, the candlelight painting her features in soft, warm gold. "I've been meaning to ask you something," he said, folding his napkin in his lap, and she glanced up, curious. "Why did you agree to marry me?" The question hung in the air, not heavy, but meaningful, and Lyra set her fork down gently. "Because I saw potential," she answered after a moment. "An alliance, yes, but also in you." And he tilted his head slightly. "Even back then?" "Especially back then, and have I lived up to it?" he asked quietly, and her eyes met his, steady and warm. "You're getting there." In the weeks that followed, the estate buzzed with preparations for a new series of initiatives Lyra had begun championing: a mentorship program for young women in business, a scholarship fund for students from underserved communities, a series of educational forums on ethical capitalism. Where Orion had once viewed philanthropy as a duty, Lyra turned it into a purpose, and Orion, to his surprise, discovered that purpose suited him. They traveled together now, New York, Zurich, Nairobi, meeting partners, visiting projects, sharing stages. Where he was sharp, she was grounding; where she challenged, he adapted. They disagreed often, but not with venom. Their conflicts sharpened them, clarified their priorities, and more than once Orion found himself reconsidering deeply held assumptions simply because she had posed the right question at the right moment. At home, their life was quieter but no less rich. Orion began collecting old books again, a childhood hobby long abandoned. Lyra had a growing collection of rare teas and spent afternoons in the library reading. They cooked together sometimes, or walked the grounds, or played chess in the evening by the fire. It was not perfect, no life is, but it was honest, and it was shared. One winter evening, as snow fell thick and slow beyond the tall windows, Orion stood by the fireplace reading over a new project proposal, and Lyra entered, holding 2 mugs of spiced cider. "I was thinking," she said as she handed him one, "we should bring in community voices earlier for the artisan market idea, not just advisory, but collaborative." He took the mug, smiling. "You're thinking 5 steps ahead of me again. And that's why you married me," she said, arching a brow. "Is that why?" And she looked at him, amused. "Partly," He set the proposal aside and took her hand. And you, why did you really marry me? She stepped closer, resting her head against his chest. Because I thought maybe you'd learn how to see. And did I? She looked up, her eyes soft. Yes, you see clearly now. Their conversation drifted into silence, and they stood together for a while, watching the fire. Orion thought back to the man he had been, angry, suspicious, resistant. He remembered the weight of expectation, the suffocating sense of obligation, and he looked now at the woman who had quietly, patiently dismantled those walls, not by forcing her way in, but by standing firm and letting him choose to lower them himself. Later that week, Orion called a meeting with the entire senior team at the Crestwood Group. The boardroom was full, the energy anticipatory, and when the formal updates concluded, he stood at the head of the table and turned to Lyra. Before we adjourn, he said, I want to formally acknowledge someone who has become more than an advisor, more than a partner behind the scenes. Her insight has shaped nearly every major decision we've made in the last 6 months. Her vision, her clarity, her unwavering standards have made us not just stronger, but better. He extended a hand toward her. Lyra Crestwood is no longer simply my wife. As of today, she will be joining our executive board. And there was a beat of silence, then applause, genuine, sustained, and full, and Lyra stood, nodded once, then addressed the room. I'm honored, she said. Not because of the title, but because of what we can build together. My role here is not just to advise, but to challenge, to question, to protect what matters most, our values. Let's make that our legacy. After the meeting, as they walked through the building hand in hand, Orion turned to her. I never imagined this is where we'd end up. And neither did I, she replied. But I think we've done well. And he smiled. Better than I could have hoped. That evening, back at the estate, they stood on the balcony beneath a vast canopy of stars. The city sparkled in the distance, and the quiet stretched between them, not empty, but full. Orion wrapped an arm around her and held her close. No matter what comes next, he said, I'm ready as long as it's with you. Lyra looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the night sky. Together, she said, and there, in the stillness of a winter night, in the heart of a home that had once felt like a prison, 2 people stood side by side, no longer strangers bound by obligation, but partners bound by choice, respect, and a love that had grown, not from what they had seen, but from what they had chosen to understand. And if this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out our other videos for more powerful stories just like this one.